Let's go ahead and get started. My name is Jeremy Scarbrough. Thank you for joining me today. If you're interested in using apologetics, I encourage you to look into it. That's not really what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about approaching apologetics and pop culture together. Let's start with an image. Let's do culture with culture. So look at the image, just the image. You may see more. When you look at the image, you might see it pull more out, like a story attached to the image. But just think about the image itself. Can you think of any moral or theological issues relating to what you see taking place here? Perhaps loss, grief, lament, maybe the problem of evil and pain, maybe with it questions of hope, maybe the human condition. We all bear some of this, right? If you recognize it, this is attached to a narrative that we know as Snow White. Consider the story that comes to mind when you view just the image. Now, what moral or theological issues or questions might come to mind in light of that greater narrative? Perhaps the story of a curse, loss, redemption, maybe beauty, evil, perhaps pride, greed, and jealousy, or even friendship and loyalty, maybe even resurrection. What about this image? The shedding of a beastly skin to find a human being inside. And we might ask profound questions from Beauty and the Beast, like what role does beauty play in Beast's salvation? If you find that you have passion for both apologetics and the arts, and you're interested in learning how to use pop culture and how to use the arts to do apologetics, but you're not really sure how to go about that, then you're in the right place. That's what we're going to think about together today. In this session, I want to unpack for you why pop culture is a powerful tool in your hands as an apologist. After considering different approaches to pop culture, whether some are more harmful or helpful than others, we will consider the connections between imagination, ethics, faith, between worldviews and the stories we share, between the power of the arts and about the power of the arts to expose our deeper convictions and to suggest new ways in which we might imagine the world together. Finally, drawing from my own experience with what time remains, I will try to offer some examples. They're my examples. They may not work perfectly for you, but I'll try to give you what has been my approach, and you can do with that as you will. Before we consider more effective ways to approach and engage culture, we should consider differing ways to approach culture and less effective ways to engage it. First, there are a number of ways that we might approach culture in general, pop culture. In his book, Hollywood Worldviews, Brian Godawa identifies two extremes for consuming films. And while he's speaking as a film director, he's speaking of films. His analysis extends well beyond films to other aspects of culture. First, we have cultural gluttons. These are those who consume culture unthinkingly. They binge on everything. Right? The latest Netflix series is done before the weekend's out. Not necessarily saying it's bad to consume, but follow me here. But they do not really stop to consider what exactly they might be consuming, putting into their minds. It's one extreme. The other extreme is cultural anorexia. Cultural anorexics are those who refuse to consume any of it, and for reasons that we might consider. And they are, so to speak, malnourished or out of touch with the culture. And while they might think that's a good thing, and maybe it works for them, this can actually hinder the accessibility of one's communication with someone who is in the culture. Godawa advocates avoiding these two extremes and instead approaching culture through the lens of redemption, seeing stories as all attempting to speak to a sense of loss and recovery. Let us call this mean between extremes the cautious consumer with a dietary discretion and a fit wit. Now, there are numerous ways to approach pop culture, specifically now as it relates to Christianity. That was pop culture in general, but what about approaching pop culture and its connection to Christianity? Non-believers may reject outright that theology has anything to offer, thus rejecting its pop cultural relevance. Some believers may purposefully distance themselves, and they may not necessarily do this to be antithetical, but because pop culture to them just seems irrelevant to the gospel and to evangelism and making an impact. Both of these are forms of separatism, and the latter is actually a form of cultural anorexia, starving yourself of it. Some theists assume a point of antithesis, emphasizing God as righteous and rejecting or condemning culture as corrupt. Unfortunately, this approach is more likely to burn bridges in the process. Here we might find one who considers himself a cultural apologist, but is really more of a cultural polemicist. And while polemics, if you're not familiar with the term, apologetics is building the case, a defense. A polemics is more of the offense when we have to tear apart or critique and deal with the problems. While polemics may be necessary at times, if that is all one does, this may eventually start to come across as uncharitable, out of touch, maybe even just mean-spirited trolling. Right? In his 1951 book, Christ and Culture, Richard Niebuhr called this paradigm the Christ against culture approach. Christ always stands in opposition to whatever trends are popular. This can lead to a more extreme form of cultural anorexia. This Christian cancel culture approach may protest any movies, music, any art which might be perceived as ungodly simply because it is either not explicitly Christian or it is clearly non-Christian. That's not a Christian story. Got to reject it. Alas, because they protest the very things that most people love and long to consume, it necessarily starts to incite division. Consider, for example, reactions to Dungeons and Dragons or heavy metal in the 20th century, or to Harry Potter in the 21st century. If it smacks of the occult and witchcraft, devil worship, got to get rid of it. Well, if it smacks of the occult, we might also have to get rid of Narnia and Tolkien, and some people would say you should. Since the 1970s, some have attacked Disney films for replacing God with magic or emphasizing individualism. Rock and roll is the devil's music, maybe you've heard that. Dancing leads to sin. Even, for those of you who know the reference, that old foosball is the devil. Can stereotypical shoes fit? Sure. But does that necessarily mean that all S are P? No. And ironically, labels can often reinforce stereotypes. In the history of metal music, for example, the us-them labeling that began in the 70s reinforced the identity of otherness from both sides and helped solidify a secular identity stereotype so that Christians who were interested in metal at the time were rejected by both secular and Christian world. Consider these following lyrics. Could it be you're afraid of what your friends might say if they knew you believe in God above? They should realize before they criticize that God is the only way to love. Now, if you had to take a wild guess to what singer or to what band, to what genre even, might you attribute lyrics like these? Gospel? Lauren Daigle? These lyrics come from Ozzy Osbourne in the Black Sabbath song, After Forever. Now, whatever you may think about Ozzy Osbourne, I have no idea where he stands between himself and God. He has given us a gem of lyrics worth pondering. And we can start a conversation with that. Maybe Ozzy is on to something, or was on to something. He was certainly on something. We can also find a secular culture against Christ's approach, seeing religious narratives as manipulative, oppressive, and harmful, thereby seeking to exposing to oppose theological transcripts in the media and culture. So if you're familiar with kind of the angle from some in the camps of critical theory or critical social justice, if it smacks of Western tradition, then you got to get rid of that, and that includes the Western narratives that are religious. So some people might approach pop culture and religion, or Christianity in specifically, to find those theological narratives in order to say, get them out. They're harmful. A lot of ways that we approach culture. Avoiding antithesis, those were the antithetical approaches. Avoiding antithesis, some people may adopt an approach of synthesis, emphasizing God as love and community as inclusive, though potentially watering down moral and theological truth. Niebuhr called this approach the Christ of culture. On this view, culture is not really in conflict with the gospel. Acknowledging good in culture, this approach attempts to merge culture with the language of Christianity. The problem, however, with treating Christ and culture as co-equals is that it can diminish the lordship of Christ and it can ignore the power of sin to suppress truth. And since one cannot serve two masters and cultural values tend to apply the stronger pressure on us, it is ultimately easier for us to give authority to the culture rather than to the king. Progressive Christianity would fall into this camp as it tends to stress care, compassion, and inclusivity, but it is criticized for de-emphasizing core aspects of Christian theology, trading truth for community. The remaining approaches to culture all fall under the heading Christ above culture. And there's a few angles here, but broadly speaking, this approach embraces a sort of biased dualism. Living between two worlds, one seeks goodness within the culture, while his or her allegiance is ultimately to God. Essentially, the idea is this: culture is affected by sin, but since culture is in many ways a reflection of the imago Dei, the image of God, in human beings together, and God cares for all of us, we are called to engage culture in order to seek transformation and understanding, and to seek the good of our city in which we dwell. Yet, culture is affected by sin, and so there is a dualistic tension. Whereas, Augustine put it, we are members of a heavenly city, yet resident aliens in an earthly city. And so we are living here, we're amidst the culture, but we're also ambassadors of another kingdom. This paradigm synthesizes where appropriate, but without compromising the seriousness of moral considerations or theological truth. And it's willing to become antithetical or polemical when necessary, though attempting to build rather than burn our dialogical bridges. Yet it generally approaches artistic expression within culture as reflecting a deep goodness in creation. Or it presses into worldview assumptions or the prescriptions attached to them in order to foster dialogue, which might ultimately point one to Christ. This, I submit, is where an effective cultural apologetics thrives. But wait, what is cultural apologetics? For some of you, you're new to apologetics, and here I am assuming you have some knowledge of that and we're ready to go. Cultural apologetics, in a general sense, is the use of cultural artifacts and ideas, especially ideas presented through the arts, to encourage apologetic discourse. I think it's especially helpful when approaching much of apologetics, but especially cultural apologetics, to understand the distinction between evangelism and pre-evangelism, gardening rather than harvesting, and to see cultural apologetics as primarily a form of gardening, not harvesting. Right? We're pulling the weeds of bad ideas. We're tilling the soil of stubborn minds or hardened hearts, planting seeds of thoughtfulness and wisdom through conversations. Francis Schaeffer once wrote, "We must never forget that the first part of the gospel is not accept Christ as Savior, but God is there. Only when one is ready to, when one understands that God is there, is one ready to hear God's solution for man." I think often we start backwards, though. In the words of Paul Gould, who wrote a text called Cultural Apologetics, the cultural apologist works to awaken those within culture to their deep-seated longing for goodness, truth, and beauty, to resurrect relevance by showing that Christianity offers plausible answers to universal human longings, and to resurrect hope. Acts 17 stands out as specifically verses 22 and 23, stands out as the biblical model here. Paul says, as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with an inscription to an unknown God. You are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and that's what I'm going to show you. So let's talk about your culture. He appeals to their poets, he appeals to their religious practices, and then uses that as a doorway to dialogue concerning deeper theological truths. This is the power of cultural apologetics, engaging culture with culture, uncovering worldview through the arts, teaching deeper truths by reaching longing hearts. Now, if we're going to consider approaching stories and the arts as opportunities for unpacking ideas of faith and worldview, then we should consider first what faith even has to do with imagination, right? And here we should clarify our meaning of faith. And here I need to give a shout out to Dr. Tim McGrew, because it was his 2014 conversation with Peter Boghossian that actually helped me to articulate more clearly my own ideas on faith. Now, we believe many things about the world, but we do not necessarily act upon all those beliefs. When we do act according to our convictions, we are wagering our view in light of reality. I have nothing invested in the belief that horses can sleep while standing, so I don't have faith in that. However, when I stop at a red light, I am fully invested in the belief that my brakes will cause my car to stop rather than accelerate. Faith, then, whether intentional or unconscious, is a wager based on our unexamined, usually, ideas about reality. We take a chance anytime we act in light of an implicit ethical or eternal question. Thus, all worldviews, even the non-theistic worldview, as they are lived out, that's the important part, are faith wagers. Simply put, faith is conviction, wagering, action. Now, if to some degree imagination plays a role in conviction, then this foundational imagining is terribly significant and therefore tethered to the questions of faith and worldview. Now, worldview makes some people uncomfortable, and this is understandable. Even as Christian apologists, we should be able to concede that. It's understandable why some people push back against the label of a worldview. James Sire points out that there's a fluid nature to worldview, and it's constantly under pressure of further contemplation, new information, and often our encounters with evil or suffering. He says, broad strokes both miss the finer points of our individual worldview and somewhat misrepresent any one person's worldview. This does not mean, however, that worldview as a concept is unimportant. As Paul Gould put it, worldview analysis is necessary, but not sufficient for cultural apologetics. So when we act upon a faith according to a background assumption, unexamined, presumptions regarding a particular way that we are imagining the world. Philosopher Charles Taylor called these background assumptions, which we usually accept because they're part of the culture or they've been handed to us. He calls these our social imaginary, the way we imagine the world together. Now, we may not all stop and analyze the nature of the world and our beliefs about it, but we do imagine the world to be a certain way. The most popular beliefs and value transcripts of the cultural moment often work themselves into the backdrop of a collective imaginary, and thereby into various seats of pop culture power, influencing value hierarchies and presumptions about the human being, about identity, about the world, about the meaning of life. Regardless of our own beliefs about our beliefs, we carry with us a default way of imagining the world to be, and with it ideas about what is right and what is good. It is this background way of seeing, which is presupposed and unanalyzed, that is so easily and powerfully shaped by pop culture through our stories and through covert transcripts from the marketplace or media. Thus, worldview analysis is necessary, but again, it's not sufficient. It's not enough for cultural apologetics. Yet, as Charles Taylor has suggested, perhaps the question of worldview is less about propositional belief and more about the way, in his words, quote, the way the universe is spontaneously imagined and therefore experienced. And this is why I submit that storytelling in the arts are so powerful and formative. All right. All cultures share stories. And our stories help us to make sense of who we are. Our stories presume and prescribe and even reify certain values and truth assertions about the world and about our place in it. In the words of Diogenes Allen and Eric Springstead, to the degree that we share narratives, we share understanding. And to the degree that there is no sharing, there is the same degree of incomprehension. We cast about the narratives that we have in order to make that which we seek to understand come into light. As philosopher Louis Poyman put it, a good story awakens our imagination to new possibilities and compels us often to rethink and revise our everyday assumptions. Yet the most powerful stories, according to George MacDonald, are not those which give us new things to think about, but those which awaken something that's already within us. Stories often capitalize on a deep desire within us, our often unspoken convictions about the way the world is or ought to be, a desire for answers concerning identity, meaning, community, the good life, the cessation of suffering, anxiety, estrangement, etc. Pop culture contains many of these narratives that we share, and we naturally use some of these narratives to understand ourselves and our world better. And we draw its water from more than one well of influence. This means that many of our identities are intertwined with many moral and theological narratives coming from different places. For pop culture is replete with narratives that tell you who you are and what you should love and how you should act. We can understand the power of here, because of this, we can understand better the power of using stories for apologetics. Alistair McGrath wrote a book called Narrative Apologetics, and in it he wrote, Christians must engage the dominant stories of our culture either by telling a better story that shows these stories are inadequate or incoherent, or through subversive storytelling in which they enter into a rival cultural narrative and retell its story in light of the Christian worldview. We are called to out-narrate the dominant stories that shape our culture by exposing their weaknesses or showing, my favorite part, how they are enfolded by our own and how they are eclipsed by a more luminous and compelling story. By the way, that enfolding, that's my approach in the Disney volume. Despite worldview differences, the stories we tell often resonate with echoes of a deeper truth that we all intuit. If the Christian story of reality is true, then it will naturally encompass shards of truth and gems of wisdom to be found within other stories that human beings tell. Now, we need to understand, though, that storytelling happens on a number of levels, not just in the book, right? From actual literary objects to film, to music, even to nonverbal forms of art, and even to advertising in the marketplace. When you hear ba-da-bum-bum-bum, you've got a story, you've got pictures, something is being communicated to you, right? So culture involves numerous forms of imaginative transcripts, and it is the cultural apologist's task to engage some of these stories we share. This aspect of sharing is really important. So here I want to kind of make a sidebar commentary because some Christians expect that all stories should explicitly give the gospel. But this is a problematic approach. Many of the stories we share do not, but many of the recurrent moral motifs that we see in some of our most celebrated non-sectarian narratives, like Disney films, actually align strikingly with the moral meta-narrative that we see in the biblical story of reality. Now, this is a powerful point. Like I said, this is an aside, but I want you to think about it for a moment. It's a powerful point, but it's also a potentially controversial one because Christians, especially the anti-culture approach Christian, Christ against culture, Christians who see Christ as always standing in opposition to culture will probably take issue with this concept. But there is a difficulty in establishing a public education with so many perspectives, once you have a number of perspectives in the mix. In the history of moral education as public education in the U.S., it became apparent that the more sectarian or specified the moral teaching became, necessarily the more divisive it became. So the conundrum is whether, when teaching something that has moral truth or even theological truth, the conundrum is whether to be more or less specific, explicit, and both actually have drawbacks. The non-sectarian path is one of archetype and ambiguity, so it's not explicitly Christian, right? And this is why Disney films never explicitly mention a Christian, well, I shouldn't say never, but usually don't explicitly mention a Christian message. And magic often stands in as a metaphor for a supernatural mediator. For some, that's not enough, right? However, a non-sectarian story is more likely to be shared across differing perspectives. That's the point I want to make here, which allows for some avenue of common ground that Christians can use to facilitate meaningful moral and theological dialogue. A sectarian, a more specific, for example, an explicitly Christian narrative, can be a sectarian narrative can be more specific morally and theologically, but because the lines are drawn more explicitly, it is less likely to be of interest to outsiders. That's probably a no-brainer, right? But it's the apologist's task to show outsiders why they ought to be interested. But back to what I already said, dialogue usually begins with some form of a shared story. So that's the conundrum. So I submit that, at least in our cultural context, the non-sectarian approach is arguably as inclusive as storytelling can be without necessarily facilitating division. This does not mean all stories are equally worth engaging, and some may indeed be worth critiquing, but we need not grow anxious in a secular world just because we see more and more secular stories. And we need not default to assault, right? Rather, we should approach all stories as potential apologetic opportunities. Now we reach one of the most powerful means of disseminating our imaginative ideas, the arts. I probably didn't even have to tell you that, right? The stories of pop culture are often written across a variety of artistic expressions, and the arts often enhance the aesthetic impact. Film is an especially potent aesthetic. Think about how many people are consumed by film, right? Netflix is where we go. Film is especially potent precisely because it is the mixing of the visual, which has its own power, and the musical, which has its own power, with storytelling, which has its own power, right? It's a coalescing of powers, presented to you in such an organic artifact that it must be lived through. And so powerful is this living through of aesthetic experience that some seek it spiritually. Charles Taylor observed a discernible historical shift from a pre-modern world enchanted with notions of cosmic order and immaterial truths to our modern disenchanted world, which has left us haunted by existential anxieties of disenchantment and desperate for finding some sense of fullness. Following the Enlightenment, he observes, we began to presume that significance is constructed by human beings. Yet our modern stories, he says, of significance became curiously religious in nature. And interestingly, the arts became a new means of seeking transcendence. James K. Smith explains this, kind of draws it out for us. Conveniently, art is never going to ask of you anything you wouldn't want to do. So we get significance without any aesthetic moral burden. The result is that many now seek aesthetic experiences in themselves, for themselves, as an attempt to satisfy a lost longing for transcendence. In short, this creates a place to go for our modern unbelief. And so we get these new sacred places of modernity. The concert hall as temple, the museum as chapel, tourism as a new pilgrimage. People are seeking an experience. Transcendent experience, he says. Elsewhere he argues that we often tie meaning to markets and habits to worship. He says, human beings are not so much defined by what we know as we are by what we love, what we long for. We are what we love, and we love what we worship. We are lovers, and our loves are shaped by our habitual practices. He writes, because our hearts are oriented primarily by what we desire, by what we love, and because those desires are shaped and molded by the habit-forming practices in which we participate, it is the rituals and the practices of the mall, the liturgies of the mall and market, this is Black Friday, by the way, that shape our imaginations and how we orient ourselves in the world. Consider our Black Friday rituals or our Super Bowl liturgies, right? We have worship going on. So pop culture and the arts are significant for several reasons, but at least for four. First, ideas impact culture, and cultural narratives influence our social imagining, how we envision the world together. Second, value education happens almost everywhere, but it happens to a significant degree through the marketplace. We often buy the very things that shape and form our values and identities. Third, the arts are often expressions of worldviews or worldview questions as they are embodied and lived out. As we consume that which provides us with either a cathartic means of voicing our dissatisfaction with the human condition, or maybe momentarily a means of momentarily catching a glimpse of something that we long to experience, we consume the worldviews and value prescriptions attached. If we don't have wisdom and discretion, discernment, we might catch some of the habit-forming ideas attached, like we catch a cold virus, without even realizing we have it or knowing where it has come from. Finally, even if subconsciously, the arts communicate something about teleological significance. Now, if you haven't taken philosophy, telos people will define it many ways, sometimes unhelpfully, but teleology has to do with telos, which has to do with a thing's purpose, its ultimate purpose, right? So when we talk about a teleological world or universe, we're talking about one that's imbued with meaning and purpose and order and the way things ought to be. There is something not to be missed in the fact that people look for significance in stories in the arts. We consume as meaningful those things which we believe at some level to possess meaningful reference. Now, what do I mean by referent? A referent is something that you point to, the thing to which you refer. Okay? C.S. Lewis once quipped, most dogs cannot understand pointing. You point to a bit of food on the floor, the dog, instead of looking at the floor, sniffs your finger. A finger is a finger to him, and that is all. His world is all fact and no meaning. But this is exactly what stories in the arts do. They point, at some level, beyond the world of merely physical facts to something meaningful, or to questions about something meaningful. Here we reach what's called the philosophy of aesthetics, questions about the nature and purpose, significance of art, and about beauty itself. But aesthetics is a really complex area of philosophical investigation, and so I cannot unpack all things aesthetics here, but I will just kind of focus on what will help me narrow down to my own perspective. But I will give you kind of a very, very quick primer here. There are several ways that philosophers approach defining the aesthetic significance of the arts. Some point to the formal qualities of the object, the form. Art's value lies within the superior ordering of the artistic elements. It is the excellence of the well-ordered object which elicits awe or demands respect or facilitates some sort of aesthetically significant experience. It really comes down to the object or the formal arrangements in the object. This approach is objective, referring to the observable qualities of the art object, emphasizing psychological experience or measurable physiological effect. Some insist that aesthetic value or significance of the arts must ultimately lie in the feelings experienced by the observer or expressed by the artist. This approach is subjective, referring to the inner, individualized experience, the artist or the audience. Still others refer to referential qualities, referring. The notion that ideas within an art object point beyond the art object itself, maybe to other art objects, maybe to something in culture, maybe to something larger. This could include arts used for propaganda or protest. It might involve metaphor, right? Metaphor, we commonly are referencing something else. Word painting and music, where the music is doing something that directly relates to the words at hand. I know that font is small, but when it says mountain, there's a leap down. But when it says hill, there's a very small movement. And made low, there's a leap down low. So we have some what's called word painting. There might be moral commentary attached to something, etc. But also we might attach subjective, meaningful, personal experience. So when we listen to a song or we experience an art object that really moves us, it may move us because it has some reference to something meaningful that we experience in our own life, right? So notice here with reference that you can have either, it could be either objective, pointing to things. One of my favorite pieces of music in the classical art music world is the Moldau is the translation. It's a depiction, musical depictions called program music of a river that runs through Prague. And so musically, it's just meant to paint this river, and then it's also meant, if you're from Czech Republic, to kind of evoke a sense of pride, national recognition, pride in your country, kind of thing. So it's serving metaphorical and referential purposes, right? So note that reference can either be objective or subjective, or even both. So there are different approaches to defining the significance of the arts, and most philosophers have typically pushed away from reference and focused on form or feeling, mostly if they're scholarly, form, probably most people in the culture feeling. Right? But there is a problem, I think, anytime that we're trying to define. There's a problem with definition when we're trying to pin down complex human experiences, right? I think the most helpful definition of art is going to be one that's robust enough to include all of this. Yet also, I think the most robust definition of art will acknowledge the fact that art is an expression of the imago Dei, the image of God. And to a significant degree then, because the image of God is the image of a rational mind, the arts are often a sort of thought experiment, right? As meaning seekers, meaningfully made in the image of a maker, a rational being, we meaningfully create our own possible worlds, or we explore questions and meanings attached to other people's possible worlds, or through our own creative processes. So that's art. Now I'm going to step into beauty. While many philosophers actually deconstruct beauty to one of these aforementioned qualities, it's nothing more than the form of the feeling, something empirical, for example. And some philosophers have even suggested that art's value is simply determined by its pragmatic usefulness. If it's useful to you, then that makes it beautiful or good. Others have tried to defend an objective sense of beauty, a real sense of beauty, attached to the aesthetic experience, which actually points beyond the experience in some way. So if you're familiar with the language, I'm moving into argument from beauty. As Doug Groothuis, philosopher who wrote the thickest book I know on Christian Apologetics, he argued, just as my experience of roundness when I see an orange is not in itself round, my experience of aesthetic excellence has an objective reference beyond the experience itself. Now, one of the basic approaches, so now I'm thinking about the way that people using the arts, people are not just approaching the significance of the arts, but how they're approaching the question of beauty or arguments for beauty. One of the basic approaches here, I think probably the most common, is to emphasize beauty as an object or to emphasize some objective quality within an object. So object X is beautiful because the beauty is referring to a greater object, right? This may be an approach you're familiar with. Plato, for example, held that beauty, if we're thinking about, if we're going to look at these paintings and call that painting beautiful, why would we do that? Well, thinking about this, Plato held that beauty is not in the painting itself, but refers to the thing being painted. It can't be here. It has to at least be here, right? Because the artist looked at that to capture it. Yet neither is it beauty in the thing that was painted, since the term beautiful can be applied to a number of things. Right? So beauty has to be bigger than that. It has to at least be an idea, right? Because I have the idea of beauty that can map onto a number of things. Yet it cannot be solely my idea, for you too have some concept of beauty as well. We might differ as what is beautiful, but we have the same working concept that we try to map onto so many different aspects of our experience. So Plato says our awareness of beauty must refer to some greater object out there, which emanates goodness so powerfully or potently that it's able to map onto a various number of various aspects of our individual experiences and give light to our understanding. Some acknowledgement of perfection, you might say, a glimpse of perfection. So that's the typical approach. If we were to simplify the argument from beauty, focusing on the object, to the existence of God, it might look like this. Now, if you're not familiar with philosophy, this is a very powerful and common argument form called the modus ponens. If P, then Q. Prove P, Q follows. That's the way that works. If P, if the world is beautiful, or if there is beauty in the world, by which I mean if there are beautiful objects in the world we can identify, then Q, God exists. There is beauty in the world, so God exists. This is the basic approach. Notice here that the emphasis seems to be on the world as an object, or our experience of beautiful objects in the world. So this is just a common approach. A lot of people prefer this approach. But my approach is a little different. An arguably lesser considered approach is to this argument from beauty is to emphasize beauty not as object but as experience. Beauty within a given experience refers to a greater experience. Okay? Now, this is C.S. Lewis's approach, actually, when he writes, if I find in myself a desire, this is his famous argument from Desire, if I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. I personally think Lewis's approach is more helpful because it focuses the focus is not really on a beautiful object per se, but the beauty of experiencing a meaningful world. In other words, an order. That's teleological language, by the way. For that is precisely what a world is, a given order. The question is whether our world is mere happenstance or whether there is a grand order. A way things should go. So, moving now into the realm beyond philosophy of aesthetics into theological aesthetics, my own perspective is that we should focus on the deeper conviction of a grand order and sense of meaningfulness that we associate with our aesthetic experiences rather than on beauty per se as an object. I hold that ethics and aesthetics are actually two sides of the same sphere. And that moral conviction actually runs deeper than our aesthetic conviction. So they're similar. We have a conviction that something is good or beautiful. The goodness is moral language. The beauty is aesthetic language. Moral conviction runs deeper than our aesthetic conviction because beauty is descriptive of moral perfection. Think about it. When God created, in the act of creation, God's order was foremost what? God called it what? Good, right? Before it was beautiful, it was affirmed as good. I think that goodness comes first. And because we want more of it, we delight in meaningfully ordered experiences, stories, and the arts. I know I'm a little bit deep right now. I'll come back up in a minute. Thomas Aquinas said it like this. Since goodness, he's trying to parse out the connection and difference between goodness and beauty. Since goodness is that which all things desire, goodness applies the aspect of an end. Beauty and goodness in a thing are identical in a sense, fundamentally, for they are based on the same thing. And consequently, goodness is praised as beauty. But they differ logically because for goodness properly relates to an appetite. Goodness is that which we desire. And therefore, goodness has the aspect of an end, that we can obtain something, the good. On the other hand, beauty relates to our cognitive faculty. Beautiful things are those which please when seen, or we might say we add when experienced. Hence, beauty consists in due proportion, for senses delight in things duly proportioned. We might say it this way. Goodness refers to our awareness and affirmation of a grand order, God's order, a way things ought to be. And by the way, ought to be, I teach ethics. Ought to be is moral language. If there's a way things ought to be, you're speaking ethics. And because the existential experience of this deep conviction that there's a way things ought to be evokes the idea of a possibility that it can be attained and that our anxieties can be extinguished, we experience beauty. Beauty is descriptive of those meaningfully ordered aspects of our experiences in which we take delight because they give rise to this deep sense of an encounter with a goodness at the end. I submit that there's a deep connection between imagination and moral conviction. In Narnian terms, a deep moral magic connecting our worlds of wonder. And that the arts can serve as a sort of mediator, facilitating questions and presenting possibilities worth pondering. Now, if you don't like the deep stuff, I'm kind of camping out there at the moment, sorry. But maybe you'll be better for it on the other side, we'll see. In light of these considerations, I submit that the most powerful cultural apologetics pivots from two foundational presumptions. And both of these are exemplified in the approach of C.S. Lewis, which is why I think his work is so powerful. First, and coincidentally, tying back to what I just said, one is emphasizing the ethical and the other is emphasizing the aesthetic, two sides of the same coin. The first conviction is this, or presumption. Human beings share a universal conviction concerning the fact of justice. Though they may differ over the definitions of the good life and descriptions of right and wrong and the just distributions of good and political systems, differing cultures often share foundation convictions. This is brought to light in C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man. If you were there last night, he unpacked that well, so I don't really have to go into that much. Of course, there will be likely some drastic differences between our moral practices, right? That's what we usually get. We usually get, just like I said with the object and the sense, we usually start focusing on the thing and we miss something deeper, I think. There may be some drastic differences, but our moral differences often come down to non-moral beliefs on which we differ, coupled with moral principles on which we agree. Namely, the conviction that certain things are due certain people. Now, I love the moral argument. It's probably my favorite, with these two, certainly. And so I do think that formalized moral arguments are powerful. I just think there's a more powerful way. Formalized moral arguments might look like this. If P, then Q, there it is again. If objective moral principles exist, now there's a lot of different ways you can spin this. The modus ponens is if P then Q, P is true so Q is true. You can spin it backwards by if you disproving Q to disprove P. A lot of different ways to hash out the moral argument, and they're all valid arguments. This is just a simplified way. If objective moral principles exist, then God exists. P is true, so Q is true. Also, this is the modus tollens, the working backwards. If Q is false, then P is false. So, the conclusion, God and morality seem to rise and fall together. That's powerful, right? That's why it's one of my favorites. But the propositional, sometimes, what do we do with that, right? I think that the more significant move in moral apologetics is not the formalized argument, not the proposition, but the observation that we all believe in the fact of justice. It only takes one universal, by the way, to refute the claim that there is no universal moral objectivity. One of my favorite examples here to press the point I'm trying to make comes from philosopher Louis Boyman, probably one of my favorite moral philosophers. He described a tribe in the Sudan that threw their deformed children to the hippo because they believed that the hippo was the god of the river and the deformed children were the hippo's property. And what he profoundly says is, we disagree with them, but we agree with them. You might scratch your head and say, why on earth would you say I agree with them? Right? Here's his point. We differ with them on non-moral beliefs. We differ on the belief that the hippo is the god of the river. We differ with them on the belief that deformed children are the hippo's property, right? But he says we agree with them on a standard principle of justice, that we ought to give what is due to whom it is due. Right? So we differ all the time on what is due and to whom is due. Yet we all agree that justice involves getting one's due. Right? That's why we say, my rights. I've been wronged. Injustice. That's a universal conviction. I think that's more powerful, even though this is powerful. Personally, I think that's a more powerful move there. So that's the first move in what I think is a really powerful cultural apologetics, is to always be pressing into that conviction that we share, right? The second foundational presumption is that stories and our aesthetic experiences, or our experiences through the arts, possess a pronounced power to go deeper than propositions, right? To stir our moral convictions and to awaken our hope for finding significance and identity. The cultural apologist recognizes that the aesthetic allure and the enchantment of a good story is attached to a deep desire for meaning. While C.S. Lewis is renowned for his propositional defenses, like Mere Christianity and other places, and moral defenses of Christianity and defenses of moral objectivity, in the latter part of his life, he focused on narrative apologetics. You know this, Narnia, right? This power. It's not just children's story. You get some profound ideas through children's, something that's accessible to children, and really good if you read it as adults. And also, there's a lot of symbolism, reference, again, in his fiction. And if you know anything about C.S. Lewis, he was moved by something that was important to all most romantics, and the romantics were really interested in aesthetic experience, by the way. But there's this concept of Sehnsucht. This is a German word that means something like a deep yearning for something that's agonizingly elusive, a sense that we're meant to experience something that's just out of our grasp, right? And this was one of the most profound concepts that had an impact on his own journey as a Christian to Christianity, and then later his own writing. It was foundational in his spiritual development and in his imaginative apologetics. Arguments from our intuitive experiences can carry an existential and pragmatic force that is difficult to ignore and that the propositional stuff doesn't give us. Right? It makes sense, but I don't feel it, right? But it's an embodied form of knowing what makes sense. We live with deep convictions concerning good and justice, evil and injustice. And this is true universally. We differ on the prescriptions, but we're unified in the conviction. This approach allows for cultural apologetics to press into not only our moral convictions, but to press into an appeal to human longing, our desperation for significance, and a hunger for hope. Let me just give you a few examples from my personal approach to cultural apologetics, in case it helps you. One, using the arts to press. So the first two, we can start from the more theoretical places art already went, right? We can start with the abstract, using the arts to press into arguments from beauty, or using the arts to press into questions of human meaning-making. You know, why do we think things are meaningful? Or maybe we're kind of working conversations to the questions of being made in the image of God, things like that. But then there are more practical approaches, using musical narratives. So music without music without words might work better. Instrumental music might work better for some of these approaches. Or metaphorically, you might work it in here. But there's so many. Most of our songs have lyrics attached, right? And they're usually telling a story and trying to communicate something. So we can use musical narratives to unpack ethical issues, theological questions, expressions of the human condition, of hope, of loss, of the goodness and relationship of community and estrangement. There are tons out there. I've been slowly putting them together, but in my own ethical class, just to give you, I guess, two, Bohemian Rhapsody is laying out a case for moral relativism, while Reba McEntire's Night Lights Went Out in Georgia is raising the question of capital punishment, right? So people are raising deep things. One thing I tell my philosophy students, you're all philosophers. You just don't realize that you are yet. We do it. We could also, maybe if you're speaking to a church, we can also use it kind of like I did earlier to expose stereotypes or problems with the kind of anti-culture approach. The example I gave with Black Sabbath, there may be some things not to like about some things Black Sabbath, but they also gave us at least one gem of wisdom that's worth talking about. Images and memes. Now, memes can be problematic, of course, when they oversimplify and create straw man and things like this, but they also can be powerful because, well, we have very short attention spans, right, these days. Also, if you can use an image to gain attention, because like this one, a lot of my students know this one. I'll use it when I'm teaching A.J. Ayer, who says that morality amounts to nothing more than boo. I don't like that. So I think of this monkey from Family Guy who's like, that's all it can mean. It can't mean that that's wrong or injustice or anything. It just means I don't like that. So my student, it resonates with him. The point is that you can use it as a kind of an attention grabber. It increases accessibility. If there's not accessibility to your message, you kind of already lost before you started. Also, you can use it to embody, to capture certain ideas. And I wish I could unpack these more, but we have some things going on here with Beauty and the Beast or Pinocchio. Let me move on. We can use the popular ideas of the culture. We can just do philosophy. Let more people need to see Christians thinking well, right? So just have conversations about the arts. Look at the sort of ideas that people are interested in and talk about them and see where they go. These all down here, this is from a question of who's stronger, Goku or Superman. That's kind of an ongoing debate. But if you think about it, our culture is fascinated with possible worlds, right? Well, we've already touched on this week, but multiverse, that can easily take you, if not into arguments not into the ontological argument, into questions of cosmological arguments, where they come from. And even if you want to go there into more theological dogmatic debates, you have questions of God's free will and sovereignty as it relates to possible worlds. This shows up in Molinism and Calvinist debates. Probably the two most helpful approaches I take here. One is we can look across stories, whether it's across songs or pieces of art or different stories, and we can look for a meta-narrative, something that keeps showing up, a conviction, a moral conviction or theological conviction that people keep pushing into and draw that out. That's my approach in one part of this. But we can also just take individual stories and we take it on its own terms. We don't try to force anything into it and just kind of unpack what's there. Some stories might, on their own terms, might serve well to illustrate a theological or moral point. Some stories might give us kind of like a counterpoint. One of the second half of this is an edited collection, and one of the authors kind of looked at Pinocchio as the question of, is it teaching a works-based faith? Salvation, is it by his working, or is something else going on there? So we can raise all kind of questions by looking at the stories. I think I'm out of time here. I'm over time. If you want to, thank you for your time. If there are any questions, I'll hang around. I don't want to step on anyone else's time. So thank you for your time.